The sound of scissors cutting through the air echoed in the gym, silencing everyone in the room. Darren stood frozen, his heart pounding as he felt his braids, his identity, and his pride on the ground one by one. The humiliation was unbearable. The sting of betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. What was supposed to be a safe space for basketball and teamwork had become a stage for cruelty and judgment. Coach Bailey's cold words rang in Darren's ears. "Now you look like you belong." But little did the coach know, the boy he tried to break would rise stronger than ever. What started as a moment of humiliation would ignite a movement that no one saw coming. Before we dive deeper into Darren's gripping journey of courage and change, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're as inspired by this story as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The morning was gray, and the air carried a faint chill as Darren Daniels stood outside his new school. The building before him was massive, an intimidating maze of brick and glass, stretching endlessly in every direction. Darren tugged the strap of his backpack tighter, his hands slightly trembling as he stared up at the unfamiliar place that would now become a part of his daily life. At just 12 years old, Darren already understood the weight of being different. He had left behind everything he knew about a lively, diverse city where he felt at home to move here, a quiet, unfamiliar town where he and his mom didn't know a single person. It had been a sudden decision. His mom, a determined and hardworking woman, had accepted a new job opportunity she couldn't pass up. Darren's dad, a passionate community activist, had stayed behind to finish some projects, promising to join them soon. For now, it was just Darren and his mom navigating this new world together. Bookmark. As he adjusted the straps of his backpack, Darren glanced at his reflection in the school's glass doors. His dark brown eyes stared back, filled with a mixture of determination and nervousness. His braids framed his face neatly. Each one meticulously made a point of pride and connection to his culture. His mom had braided his hair the night before, her fingers gentle but firm as she worked. "Remember, Darren," she'd said that morning over breakfast, her voice full of encouragement, "don't let anyone make you feel like you need to change to fit in. Be proud of who you are. The right people will see the real you." Her words had stayed with him, a small but steady flame of confidence in his chest. He nodded to his reflection, silently repeating her advice as he stepped through the doors. The moment he entered the hallway, Darren felt it. The stairs, the quiet whispers seemed to ripple through the air like a current. "Who's that?" "Look at his hair." Darren kept his head high, pretending not to notice, but the heat rose to his face. He clenched his fists, gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The hallways were a cacophony of noise, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, and the occasional burst of laughter. Darren tried to navigate the chaos, scanning for room numbers, while avoiding direct eye contact with the other kids. By the time he reached his first class, his heart was pounding. The teacher, a stern-looking woman with wire-framed glasses, glanced up as Darren walked in. "Ah, you must be Darren Daniels," she said, her smile thin and perfunctory. She gestured toward an empty seat near the back. Darren nodded and made his way to the seat, feeling the weight of curious stares from his classmates pressing down on him. He slid into the chair, setting his backpack on the floor, and focused on keeping his breathing steady. The lesson began, but Darren found it hard to concentrate. His thoughts wandered, his mind painting vivid memories of his old school. Back home, classrooms were filled with kids of every background. There, his braids had been just another part of the colorful tapestry of identities. Here he felt like a single bold stroke of paint on an otherwise blank canvas. Lunchtime brought another wave of anxiety. Darren stood in the doorway of the cafeteria, tray in hand, scanning the room for a place to sit. His stomach churned as he imagined sitting alone. But then he saw a bright smile and a friendly wave. "Hey, new kid, over here." It was a girl with curly hair tied into a loose ponytail. She was sitting with a boy who wore glasses and an oversized hoodie. Darren hesitated for a moment, unsure if they were serious, but when the girl waved again, he walked over. "I'm Sophie," the girl said as Darren slid into the seat beside her. "And this is Ethan." "What's your name?" "Darren," he replied, his voice shy but steady. Sophie grinned. Nice to meet you, Darren. So where are you from? As they chatted, Darren felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Sophie and Ethan asked questions about his old school, his favorite hobbies, and his love for basketball. They seemed genuinely interested, and for the first time all day, Darren felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could find a place for himself here. But just as Darren began to relax, a voice from a nearby table cut through their conversation like a blade. "What's with the braids?" Darren froze. The voice belonged to a tall boy with a smug expression, flanked by a group of kids who snickered at his words. "Looks like someone's trying way too hard to get noticed," the boy added, his tone dripping with mockery. Darren's cheeks burned as he clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Sophie, however, wasn't about to let it slide. "Why don't you mind your own business, Ryan?" she shot back, her voice sharp. Ryan shrugged, smirking. "Just saying." Sophie turned back to Darren, lowering her voice. "Don't let them get to you. They're just ignorant." Darren nodded, but the boy's words lingered, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. That night, as Darren lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The stares, the whispers, and the mocking laughter all felt like an overwhelming tide, threatening to pull him under. He missed his old school, his old friends, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who understood him without question. But then, his mom's voice echoed in his mind. "Be who you are." Darren held on to that thought, letting it soothe the ache in his chest. Tomorrow would be another day, and he promised himself that he wouldn't let anyone make him feel ashamed of who he was. The next morning, Darren stepped out of his mom's car with renewed determination. The whispers and stares from the day before still weighed on him, but he repeated his mom's words in his mind like a mantra. Be proud of who you are. He walked through the school doors, trying to keep his focus forward. The hallways buzzed with activity, but Darren noticed how quiet it got as he passed certain groups of kids. He felt the weight of their eyes following him, the subtle shift in tone as whispers began. Still, he didn't let his steps falter. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. By mid-morning, Darren had already faced a few passive-aggressive comments, the kind that sounded harmless on the surface but cut deep when you knew they were aimed at you. "Wow, that's an interesting hairstyle," one girl had said, her tone oozing with fake curiosity. "Do you really think you're allowed to wear your hair like that here?" A boy muttered just loud enough for Darren to hear as he walked by. It was exhausting. Darren wasn't the type to lash out or make a scene, but he could feel the tension building in his chest with every passing remark. In math class, he tried to focus on the lesson, but the teacher's gaze lingered on him just a little too long, her expression somewhere between curious and skeptical. It reminded Darren of the way people back home would look at tourists like he didn't belong. He spent the entire period keeping his head down, scribbling answers in his notebook, and ignoring the stifling silence around him. Lunchtime came, and Darren found himself hesitating at the cafeteria doors again. A part of him wanted to turn around, find a quiet corner somewhere, and eat alone. But then he spotted Sophie and Ethan waving at him from their table near the window. Relief washed over him as he made his way over and slid into the seat beside them. "Hey, Darren." Sophie greeted with her usual enthusiasm. "How's day 2 treating you?" Darren gave a small shrug. "It's okay," he said, trying to sound casual. Ethan adjusted his glasses, looking at Darren with genuine concern. "Ignore the idiots," he said bluntly. "They're just jealous because you're cooler than them." Darren couldn't help but smile at Ethan's matter-of-fact tone. "Seriously," Sophie added, leaning in. "You're awesome. They're just too immature to get it." Darren felt a little lighter hearing their words. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad, he thought. Maybe he could handle this after all. But the moment was short-lived. At a nearby table, a group of kids was whispering and sneaking glances in Darren's direction. It wasn't long before one of them, Ryan, the tall boy from yesterday, decided to speak up again. "Yo, Darren," Ryan called out, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. Darren froze, feeling the eyes of dozens of students turn toward him. "Nice braids," Ryan said, smirking. "What are you trying to prove, huh? That you're different? That you're special?" Darren's stomach twisted, and he clenched his fists under the table. Before he could respond, Sophie shot Ryan a glare that could have cut through steel. "Why don't you mind your own business, Ryan?" she snapped, her voice loud enough to silence the chatter in the room. Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender, still grinning. "Chill, I'm just making an observation." Ethan muttered something under his breath that Darren didn't quite catch, but it sounded suspiciously like an insult aimed at Ryan. Sophie turned back to Darren, her expression softening. "Don't let him get to you," she said firmly. "He's just a jerk who thinks being loud makes him important." Darren nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't quite go away. That evening, Darren sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly poking at his dinner. His mom noticed his silence and set down her fork, her eyes filled with concern. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Darren hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kind of." He didn't want to burden her with every detail. He was already working so hard to make this transition easier for both of them. But as much as he tried to downplay it, the weight of the day was written all over his face. His mom reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "You're strong, Darren," she said softly. "I know it's hard right now, but you'll get through this, and you're not alone." Her words were warm and reassuring, but Darren still felt the heavy knot of doubt in his chest. He wanted to believe her, but each day at this school felt like climbing a mountain that only got steeper. The next day, things started off much the same. The whispers, the stares, the offhanded comments, they were all there, waiting for Darren as soon as he walked through the doors. But this time, Darren tried to channel his mom's advice. He held his head a little higher, ignored the comments a little better, and focused on the small moments of kindness from Sophie and Ethan. During history class, the teacher assigned a group project, pairing Darren with Sophie and another boy named Lucas. "So what's the project about?" Darren asked, grateful to have Sophie as a partner. "We're supposed to research a historical figure who challenged societal norms," Sophie said, flipping through the pages of her textbook. "Any ideas?" Darren thought for a moment, then hesitated. "What about someone from the civil rights movement?" he suggested tentatively. Sophie's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea." Lucas, who had been quiet until now, nodded. "Yeah, that could work. Maybe someone who stood up against discrimination or unfair treatment." As they brainstormed, Darren felt a small spark of hope. For the first time in days, he wasn't just the new kid or the boy with the braids. He was contributing, and his voice mattered. The spark carried him through the rest of the day. But by the time gym class rolled around, his confidence started to waver again. The gym was loud and chaotic as students filed in, changing into their uniforms and gathering for warm-ups. Darren found a quiet corner to tie his sneakers, trying to avoid the attention of Coach Bailey, who was already barking orders at a group of students near the basketball hoop. But avoiding attention wasn't enough. The moment Coach Bailey's eyes landed on Darren, his expression hardened. "Daniels!" the coach barked, pointing at him. "Over here!" Darren swallowed hard, walking over as the other students turned to watch. "Those braids," Coach Bailey said, his tone sharp and critical. "You think they're helping your game? Or are they just a distraction?" Darren froze, his mind racing for a response. But before he could say anything, Coach Bailey waved him off. "Just focus on the drills," the coach said dismissively. "And try not to trip over your hair." The comment drew a few snickers from the other students, and Darren felt his cheeks burn with humiliation. He clenched his fists, determined not to let anyone see how much it bothered him. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Darren walked into the gym the next day with a heavy feeling in his chest. He'd spent the entire night replaying Coach Bailey's words in his mind. No matter how much he tried to shrug it off, the coach's tone, sharp, dismissive, and full of judgment, clung to him like a dark cloud. The gym had always been one of Darren's favorite classes back at his old school. It was where he could forget everything else and just focus on the rhythm of the game. Basketball, in particular, was his escape. On the court, Darren felt like he was truly his true self. Quick, confident, and in control. But here, things felt different. Coach Bailey was already barking orders when Darren arrived, clipboard in hand and a whistle hanging around his neck. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a booming voice that seemed to carry across the entire gym. His reputation as a strict, no-nonsense coach had preceded him, and Darren could feel the tension in the air as students scrambled to follow his commands. Daniels. Coach Bailey's voice rang out the moment Darren stepped onto the court. Darren flinched but quickly jogged over. "Yes, Coach?" Coach Bailey's eyes scanned him from head to toe, lingering on his braids. There was no mistaking the disapproval in his gaze. "Listen up," the coach said, his tone clipped. "In my gym, we have rules, and that includes how you present yourself. We're here to work, not to make fashion statements." The words hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but the coach was already moving on, clapping his hands and shouting at the rest of the class to start warm-ups. Darren threw himself into the drills, trying to shake off the sting of the coach's words. He sprinted up and down the court, practiced layups, and focused on keeping his form tight. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that Coach Bailey was watching him more closely than anyone else. "Daniels," the coach barked again during a passing drill. "Is that how you're supposed to do it? Pay attention." Darren gritted his teeth and adjusted his stance, but the criticism kept coming. Every slight mistake he made seemed to draw another sharp comment from the coach. "Focus, Daniels, or are those braids weighing you down?" The comment sent a ripple of laughter through some of the other students, and Darren felt his face burn with humiliation. He wanted to yell, to defend himself, to tell the coach that his hair had nothing to do with how he played, but he didn't. Instead, he kept his head down and pushed through the rest of practice, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. After class, Darren was the last to leave the gym. He sat on the bench, unlacing his sneakers with trembling hands. The other students had already filed out, their laughter echoing down the hallway. But Darren stayed behind, trying to collect himself. He heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Sophie and Ethan standing by the door. "Hey," Sophie said softly, her brow furrowed with concern. "You okay?" Darren shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It's nothing. Doesn't sound like nothing," Ethan said, leaning against the doorframe. "Coach Bailey was on your case the whole time. It's not fair." "It's fine," Darren muttered, though his voice wavered. "I can handle it." Sophie crossed her arms, her expression serious. "You shouldn't have to handle it, Darren. He's singling you out, and it's not right." Darren didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. The next day, things only got worse. Coach Bailey introduced a new set of drills during practice, and Darren, determined to prove himself, gave it everything he had. He sprinted faster, jumped higher, and poured all his energy into the game. But it didn't matter. Every time Darren stumbled, hesitated, or missed a shot, Coach Bailey was there with another biting remark. "Daniels, are you even trying? Maybe if you spent less time on your hair and more time on your game, you'd actually improve." Darren could feel his teammates' eyes on him, some filled with pity, others with thinly veiled amusement. The humiliation was unbearable, but he refused to let it show. He gritted his teeth and kept going, determined not to give the coach the satisfaction of seeing him break. By the end of practice, Darren was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. As he walked off the court, Sophie and Ethan were waiting for him by the locker room. "That was brutal," Ethan said, shaking his head. "He's really got it out for you." "I don't get it," Sophie added, her voice filled with frustration. "Why is he picking on you like that?" Darren shrugged, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe he just doesn't like me." Sophie frowned. "It's more than that, Darren. It's not just about you. It's about him and his attitude. What he's doing isn't okay." Darren wanted to believe her, but the weight of the coach's words still hung heavy on his mind. That night, Darren lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the day's events over and over, each sharp comment from Coach Bailey cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. Darren loved the game, but he could feel the joy it once brought him slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of frustration and doubt. He thought about his dad and the countless stories his father had shared about standing up for what's right. Darren had always admired his dad's courage, but now, faced with his own challenge, he felt small and unsure. As the hours ticked by, Darren made a silent promise to himself. No matter how hard it got, he wouldn't let Coach Bailey make him feel ashamed of who he was. The tension in the gym was palpable as Darren arrived for basketball practice the next day. He felt the familiar weight of Coach Bailey's disapproving gaze the moment he stepped onto the court. The air was heavy with an unspoken challenge, and Darren braced himself for what he knew would be another grueling session. Today, he told himself, he would prove the coach wrong. He tied his sneakers tighter than usual and grabbed a ball, warming up with a few sharp dribbles before sinking a clean jump shot. For a brief moment, he let himself enjoy the satisfaction of the swish. Bookmark? But then Coach Bailey's voice cut through the air like a whip. Daniels, stop showing off and focus. Darren bit back a retort, swallowing his frustration as the rest of the team snickered. He joined the group huddle, determined to keep his head down and avoid further confrontation. The practice began, and Darren threw himself into every drill, his body moving with precision and determination. He sprinted faster, jumped higher, and concentrated on perfecting every pass. But, no matter how hard he worked, Coach Bailey found something to criticize. Daniels, you call that defense? Pick up the pace, you're slowing everyone down. And then, the comment Darren had come to dread. Maybe if you spent less time on those braids, you'd actually get somewhere on this court. Darren's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to keep going. He could feel the stares of his teammates boring into him, some pitying, others amused. His hands clenched the ball tighter, his nails digging into the leather. The breaking point came during a passing drill. Darren hesitated for half a second, unsure of his next move, and the ball slipped through his fingers. It bounced off the court and rolled to the feet of Coach Bailey, who snatched it up with an exasperated sigh. Daniels, the coach barked, his face red with frustration. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're too distracted, too busy trying to stand out with your statement hair. Darren felt his chest tighten as Coach Bailey marched toward him, the ball tucked under one arm. The gym fell silent, the other players frozen in place as they watched the scene unfold. Coach Bailey stopped in front of Darren, towering over him. I've had enough, he said, his voice low but laced with menace. You think this is a joke? That you can just waltz in here and make a spectacle of yourself? I'm not trying to, Darren started, his voice shaking. But Coach Bailey cut him off. No excuses. Before Darren could react, the coach reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pair of scissors. The room seemed to freeze in time as Coach Bailey raised the scissors, his expression cold and unyielding. Darren's heart raced, panic surging through him as he realized what was about to happen. Coach, wait, he began, stepping back, but Bailey grabbed his shoulder with a firm grip, holding him in place. You need to learn what it means to follow the rules, the coach said, his voice steady and devoid of empathy. This isn't about you, Daniels. It's about the team, and I don't tolerate distractions. With one swift motion, Coach Bailey snipped through one of Darren's braids. The severed hair fell to the floor, and a collective gasp echoed through the gym. Darren stood frozen, his mind reeling with shock and disbelief. He couldn't process what was happening, couldn't comprehend how this had escalated so quickly. Coach Bailey moved on to the next braid, his hands steady and deliberate. You'll thank me for this one day, he muttered, almost to himself. Discipline builds character. Stop, Darren shouted, yanking his shoulder away, but the coach's grip tightened. The humiliation was overwhelming. Darren could feel the sting of tears threatening to spill over, but he refused to cry, refused to give Coach Bailey that satisfaction. By the time the last braid hit the floor, Darren felt like a hollow shell of himself. His scalp stung where the scissors had pulled too close, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional wound. Coach Bailey stepped back, inspecting his work with a smug expression. There, he said loudly, addressing the rest of the team. Now Daniels looks like a real player, focused, disciplined, ready to work. Darren stared at the pile of his braids on the floor, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and despair. He couldn't take it anymore. Without a word, he turned and bolted from the gym, ignoring the stunned silence of his teammates and the whispers that followed him. He ran through the hallways, the sound of his sneakers echoing off the walls. His vision blurred with tears as he pushed open the school's side door and stumbled outside. The cool air hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. Darren found a bench near the edge of the school grounds and collapsed onto it, burying his face in his hands. The humiliation, the anger, and the utter sense of betrayal all came crashing down at once. How could this have happened? How could someone in a position of authority do something so cruel, so dehumanizing? Darren. The sound of Sophie's voice broke through his haze of despair. He looked up to see her and Ethan running toward him, their faces etched with worry. Sophie reached him first, dropping to her knees beside the bench. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Darren shook his head, unable to speak. Ethan stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists. "I can't believe he did that," he muttered, his voice low with anger. "That's not just wrong, it's messed up." Sophie placed a comforting hand on Darren's shoulder. "We're going to do something about this," she said firmly. "He's not going to get away with it." Darren wiped his face with the back of his hand, his voice shaky as he finally managed to speak. "What can I do?" he asked, his tone filled with despair. "He's the coach. No one's going to believe me over him." "You're not alone, Darren," Sophie said, her eyes blazing with determination. "We've got your back." As Darren sat on that bench surrounded by his friends' unwavering support, a small spark of resolve began to take root. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let this stand. Coach Bailey had crossed a line, and Darren wouldn't stay silent. That evening, Darren sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his contact list and stopped at his dad's number. For a moment, he hesitated. His dad, James Daniels, was a respected activist and community leader, a man who fought tirelessly for justice and equality. Darren admired him deeply but didn't want to burden him with this. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of Coach Bailey's smug expression or the weight of his braids falling to the gym floor. The humiliation and anger churned inside him, refusing to be silenced. Taking a deep breath, Darren tapped the call button. "Darren!" His father's warm, familiar voice came through the line. "Hey, kiddo. How's it going?" For a moment, Darren couldn't answer. His throat tightened and tears stung his eyes. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice shaky. "Dad, something happened at school." The cheerful tone in his father's voice faded instantly. "What's wrong, son? Talk to me." Darren began recounting everything, his words tumbling out in a rush. The stares, the whispers, the coach's comments, and finally, the horrific moment when Coach Bailey cut his braids in front of the entire team. His voice cracked as he relived the memory, the pain and anger fresh in his mind. There was silence on the other end of the line, but Darren could hear his dad's breathing, heavy and deliberate. When his father finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but Darren could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. "He did what?" Darren swallowed hard. "He said my hair was a distraction and that I needed to look professional. Then, he just cut it off, right there, in front of everyone." James Daniels was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was firm and resolute. "Darren, listen to me. What that man did was not only wrong but was a violation of your dignity and your rights. This isn't something we're going to let slide. Do you understand?" Darren nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. "Yeah, I'm going to make some calls," his dad continued. "We'll handle this. But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't let this break you. You are stronger than this, Darren. You hear me? You are not defined by what he did to you." Darren felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed to quiet, "I promise." The next morning, Darren woke to the sound of his mom's voice calling him for breakfast. He dragged himself out of bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, and shuffled into the kitchen. His mom was already at the table, her brow furrowed as she read something on her phone. When she looked up and saw Darren, her face softened. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" "Okay," Darren replied, though it wasn't entirely true. She studied him for a moment before sighing. "Your dad called me last night. He told me what happened." Darren's stomach twisted. He hadn't wanted to worry her, but now it was too late. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But you're not alone in this, Darren. We're going to fight back." Her words filled Darren with a flicker of hope, but the thought of confronting Coach Bailey or the school still filled him with dread. Later that day, Sophie and Ethan showed up at Darren's house. Sophie had a determined look in her eyes while Ethan carried a notebook under his arm. "We've been talking," Sophie said as Darren let them in, and we're not going to let Coach Bailey get away with this. What can we do? Darren asked, his voice hesitant. A lot, Sophie replied, sitting down at the kitchen table. First, we spread the word. Everyone in school needs to know what happened. The more people who support you, the harder it'll be for the school to ignore it. Ethan nodded, flipping open his notebook. We can organize a protest, get students to show up in solidarity. Maybe wear braids or something similar to make a statement. Darren felt a surge of gratitude for his friends, but also a pang of doubt. What if no one listens? Or worse? What if it makes things worse? Sophie leaned forward, her expression fierce. Then we'll keep fighting. Darren, what he did to you was wrong, and everyone needs to know it. We're not letting this go. By Monday morning, the plan was in motion. Sophie spread the word through social media while Ethan quietly rallied students in school. When Darren walked into the building, he was met with something he hadn't expected. Solidarity. Dozens of students had shown up wearing braids, headbands, and other cultural hairstyles. Some even carried small signs with phrases like, "Our hair, our pride, and respect our identity." Darren's heart swelled as he walked through the hallways. For the first time in days, he didn't feel alone. Sophie and Ethan met him near his locker, both grinning. "What do you think?" Sophie asked. "It's amazing," Darren said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "This is just the beginning," Ethan added. "We're going to make them listen." During lunch, the protest moved to the school courtyard. Students gathered in a circle, holding their signs and chanting slogans. Darren stood at the center, feeling the support of his peers surrounding him like a protective shield. The school administration took notice quickly. By the time the protest had reached full swing, the principal, Ms. Henson, appeared in the courtyard, her expression tight with frustration. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the crowd. Sophie stepped forward, unflinching. "We're standing up for Darren," she said firmly. "What Coach Bailey did was wrong, and we won't stay silent about it." The principal's face reddened, but she seemed taken aback by Sophie's boldness. She looked around at the sea of students, their signs held high, their expressions resolute. "We'll be addressing this matter," Ms. Henson said after a moment, though her tone lacked conviction. "But for now, I need everyone to return to class." The crowd didn't move. "We'll go back," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "But only after you promise that this will be taken seriously." The principal hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "I'll schedule a meeting with Darren and his parents." Satisfied, the students began to disperse, their heads held high. As Darren walked back to class, Sophie and Ethan by his side, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time he believed that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The day after the protest, the school was buzzing with whispers. Darren could feel the shift in energy the moment he walked through the front doors. Students exchanged glances as he passed, some nodding in encouragement, while others whispered behind their hands. Even teachers seemed unusually tense, their eyes darting toward him before quickly. At first, Darren felt nervous under the scrutiny, but as the day went on, he realized the whispers weren't about him alone. They were about what the students had done the day before. The protest had made an impact. That afternoon, Darren's dad, James Daniels, arrived at the school for the meeting with the principal. Dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a folder filled with notes, he exuded calm authority. Darren sat beside him in the principal's office, his stomach churning with anxiety. Principal Henson greeted them with a strained smile. "Daniels, Darren, thank you for coming in. We wanted to address the recent incident." James didn't return the smile. He placed the folder on the desk and leaned forward slightly. "Let's call it what it is, Miss Henson," he said, his tone measured but firm. "What happened wasn't just an incident. It was a gross violation of my son's rights and a clear example of discriminatory behavior." Miss Henson's smile faltered. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Daniels, and I assure you that we are taking this matter seriously. Coach Bailey has been placed on temporary leave while we conduct an internal investigation." "That's a start," James replied. "But it's not enough." James opened the folder and began to lay out his case. He spoke about Darren's experience, highlighting how Coach Bailey's actions were not just inappropriate, but also damaging to Darren's sense of identity and self-worth. He referenced laws protecting students, rights to express their culture, and cited cases where similar behavior had led to legal consequences. "I want to be very clear," James said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about Darren. It's about the message your school is sending to every student. When you allow someone in a position of authority to humiliate and degrade a child, you are teaching all of your students that discrimination is acceptable. That is unacceptable to me, and it should be unacceptable to you as well." Miss Henson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We agree that this matter needs to be addressed. I assure you, we are working on it." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "Working on it isn't enough. I'm here to ensure that this school takes real actionable steps to prevent something like this from happening again." By the time the meeting ended, Darren felt a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. His dad had pushed hard, demanding not just an apology, but systemic changes within the school. The principal had promised to bring the issue to the school board and would provide an update by the end of the week. As they left the office, Darren turned to his dad. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" James placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "If they don't, we'll make sure they have no choice." Outside of school, the story had begun to gain traction. Local news outlets picked up the details of what had happened, thanks in part to James's efforts to spread awareness. Articles appeared online, and community members started voicing their outrage. One evening, Darren was scrolling through his phone when he saw a news segment featuring his dad. James was standing on the steps of a local community center, speaking to a crowd of reporters. "No child should ever have to endure what my son endured," he said, his voice passionate but controlled. "This isn't just about a haircut. It's about respect, dignity, and the right to express one's identity without fear of judgment or punishment." Darren felt a swell of pride as he watched his dad speak. For the first time since the incident, he began to feel like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Meanwhile, Sophie and Ethan were hard at work, rallying more support at school. They organized a petition demanding that the school take immediate action against Coach Bailey and implement policies to protect students' cultural expression. By the end of the week, they had gathered hundreds of signatures from students, teachers, and even parents. When Sophie handed Darren the thick stack of papers, her eyes sparkled with determination. "We're with you, Darren, every step of the way." The next day, a second protest was held in the school courtyard. This time, the crowd was even larger, with students, parents, and community members all standing together. Many held signs with powerful messages. "Our culture, our pride. Discrimination has no place here. Respect diversity." Darren stood at the center of the crowd, flanked by Sophie and Ethan. He felt a wave of emotion as he looked around, seeing so many people standing up for him. When his dad arrived, he stepped up to the makeshift podium and addressed the crowd. His voice was strong and unwavering as he spoke about the importance of standing against injustice. "This is not just about my son," he said. "This is about every child who has ever been made to feel small or unworthy because of who they are. Today we send a message. We will not be silent. We will not back down." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing across the school grounds. The pressure on the school continued to build. Local activists joined the fight, offering legal support and amplifying the story on social media. Soon, the issue was drawing attention beyond the town, with people from neighboring communities voicing their support. By the end of the week, the school board announced that they would hold a public meeting to address the concerns raised by Darren and his family. It was a small victory, but it felt like a step in the right direction. As Darren sat with his dad and friends that evening, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time he truly believed they could make a difference. Sophie leaned over, her eyes alight with determination. "We're not stopping until this school changes for the better." Ethan nodded in agreement. "They're going to see that we mean business." Darren smiled, the weight on his chest feeling just a little lighter. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Coach Bailey's actions define him. With the support of his friends, family, and community, he was ready to keep fighting for justice. The school board meeting was held in the large auditorium at Darren's school. Rows of chairs were filled with students, parents, and community members. The buzz of anticipation filled the air as people settled into their seats. Darren sat with his dad in the front row, Sophie and Ethan flanking him on either side. On the stage, members of the school board shuffled papers nervously. The weight of the attention surrounding this issue was evident in their tight expressions and whispered conversations. At the center of the panel sat Principal Henson, her usual air of authority replaced with visible discomfort. When the meeting began, the board chair addressed the room. We're here tonight to discuss the recent concerns raised by the Daniels family and the broader community regarding the actions of Coach Bailey and the policies of our school. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. We will begin by hearing a statement from Mr. James Daniels, who has requested to speak on behalf of his son. Darren's dad stood up, his posture confident and commanding. As he approached the microphone, the room grew silent. "Good evening," James began, his voice steady but powerful. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I am here not just as Darren's father, but as an advocate for every child in the school who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened to my son was more than just an incident. It was an attack on his identity, on his culture, and on his right to express who he is. When a person in a position of authority chooses to humiliate a child in such a way, they are not just failing as a teacher. They are failing as a human being. The room was so quiet that Darren could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. James continued, his tone resolute. "This is not just about a single coach or a single incident. This is about the culture we are fostering in our schools. Are we teaching our children to embrace diversity and inclusion, or are we teaching them that conformity is the price of acceptance?" A ripple of applause broke out in the audience, quickly growing louder. After James finished, the board opened the floor to other speakers. One by one, students, parents, and even a few teachers stepped forward to share their thoughts. Sophie was among the first to speak. She gripped the microphone tightly, her voice steady but filled with passion. "I've known Darren for just a short time, but I can tell you, he's one of the most genuine, hard-working people I've ever met. What happened to him wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. And it's not the kind of behavior we should tolerate in our schools." Ethan followed, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with quiet intensity. Darren's hair wasn't a distraction. If anything, the only distraction was the way Coach Bailey treated him. That kind of behavior doesn't belong in a classroom or on a basketball court. As more people spoke, the tide of support for Darren became undeniable. A parent stood up, her voice shaking as she recounted how her own daughter had faced subtle but painful discrimination in the same school. A teacher shared her frustration at the lack of diversity training among the staff, saying, "We're educators. It's our job to teach students to respect each other's differences, not to make them feel ashamed of who they are." By the time the last speaker had finished, the school board members looked visibly overwhelmed. It was clear that this was no longer just an internal issue, but was a full-blown community movement. The board announced that Coach Bailey's suspension would be extended indefinitely, while a formal investigation was conducted. Additionally, they pledged to implement mandatory diversity and cultural awareness training for all staff. Principal Henson stepped up to the microphone, her voice tight but measured. "On behalf of the administration, I want to extend our apologies to Darren Daniels and his family. We recognize that what happened was unacceptable, and we are committed to making changes to ensure that all students feel respected and valued." The apology felt half-hearted to Darren, but it was a step in the right direction. The following weeks saw the beginning of real changes. The school partnered with a local civil rights organization to create a comprehensive diversity program. Workshops were held for teachers and staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and the importance of fostering an inclusive environment. Darren noticed small but meaningful shifts around the school. Posters promoting diversity and inclusion began appearing in the hallways. Morning announcements included messages about respecting differences and standing against discrimination. And most importantly, students seemed to feel empowered to express themselves in ways they hadn't before. One afternoon, Darren was walking to class when he saw a younger student with braids similar to his own. The boy, who had been painfully shy since Darren first arrived, looked up and met Darren's eyes. "Hey," Darren said, offering a small smile. The boy hesitated, then smiled back. "Hi." It was a small interaction, but it meant the world to Darren. He could see the ripple effect of what had happened, the way his fight for respect had opened the door for others to feel proud of who they were. Sophie and Ethan continued to play a major role in keeping the momentum going. They organized a student-led group focused on promoting inclusion and addressing issues of bias within the school. Darren joined as well, finding a new sense of purpose in helping others feel seen and heard. The group quickly gained traction, with students from all grade levels joining. They held meetings, organized events, and even worked with the administration to draft new policies protecting students' rights to express their cultural identities. One day, Darren received an unexpected invitation. The school was launching a new cultural awareness course, and they wanted him to be the first guest speaker. At first, Darren felt a surge of nerves. Public speaking wasn't exactly his strength. But as he thought about the journey he had been on, the pain, the resilience, and the support from his friends and family, he realized he had something important to say. Standing in front of the class a week later, Darren felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest. But as he began to speak, his voice grew steadier. He told the students about what had happened to him, about how it had felt to be singled out and humiliated. But he also spoke about the strength he had found in his friends, his family, and his community. "The hardest thing to do," Darren said, his voice filled with conviction, "is to stand up for yourself when it feels like the world is against you. But I promise you, it's worth it. Because when you stand up, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who comes after you." The room erupted into applause, and Darren felt a swell of pride. Darren's words that day didn't just linger in the classroom. They reverberated across the school. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like the new kid or the boy whose braids had been cut. Instead, he felt like someone who had a voice, someone who could make a difference. When he walked through the hallways, the glances weren't judgmental, they were admiring. Students nodded at him, not out of pity, but out of respect. And yet, Darren didn't let this newfound attention go to his head. He understood that the fight wasn't over, and the changes he'd seen so far were only the beginning. The school's diversity program had started to take shape, but its potential was still fragile, like the first green shoots of spring. Darren didn't want this to be just another initiative that faded into the background once the initial buzz died down. He wanted it to mean something. One afternoon, Sophie and Ethan caught up with him as he was heading to his next class. "You know they're naming the diversity course after you, right?" Sophie said, grinning. Darren blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What?" Ethan adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Yeah, we overheard Principal Henson talking about it. They're calling it the Darren Initiative for Cultural Awareness. Pretty cool, huh?" Darren's first instinct was to laugh it off, but the weight of the gesture slowly settled in. "They're serious?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Dead serious?" Sophie said. "And honestly, you deserve it." Darren wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was proud, but another part of him felt the responsibility that came with such recognition. Later that day, Darren found himself sitting in the library, staring at a blank page in his notebook. The teacher of the new cultural awareness course had asked him to help shape the first lesson, saying that his perspective could guide how the class would be structured. It felt daunting. Darren wasn't used to people looking to him for answers. But as he sat there, memories began to flood back. The stairs in the hallways, the whispers, the sharp words from Coach Bailey, and finally, the sound of scissors cutting through his braids. He thought about how powerless he'd felt in that moment, how the humiliation had seemed to swallow him whole. And then he thought about what had come after the protest, the speeches, the voices that had joined his own to demand change. Slowly, Darren began to write. He didn't focus on the past alone, but on what could come next. He wrote about the importance of understanding each other's backgrounds and celebrating differences rather than fearing them. His words weren't polished, but they were honest, and that was enough. The first session of the new course arrived faster than Darren expected. He stood at the front of the classroom, surrounded by a mix of students from different grades. Some looked curious, others skeptical. But all of them were there because they wanted to be. Darren took a deep breath and began. "Growing up, I never thought much about my hair," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "It was just a part of me, a part of my culture and my family. My mom used to braid it while telling me stories about where we came from, and my dad always told me to be proud of who I am." He paused, meeting the eyes of the students in front of him. "But when I came here, I realized that not everyone sees it that way. Some people look at you and only see what's different. They don't try to understand it, they just want it to go away." The room was silent, the students hanging on his every word. "What happened to me wasn't just about hair," Darren continued. "It was about being made to feel like I didn't belong. But here's the thing. None of us should ever have to change who we are to fit someone else's idea of normal." By the time he finished speaking, Darren wasn't sure if his words had made an impact. But then, one of the younger students raised their hand. "Thanks for saying that," they said, their voice quiet but sincere. "I think a lot of us needed to hear it." Darren nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. In the weeks that followed, the Darren Initiative became more than just a course. It became a movement within the school. Students began sharing their own stories during the sessions, talking openly about moments when they'd felt out of place or judged. Teachers started attending as well, listening to their students with newfound empathy. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable began to crack, replaced by a growing sense of understanding and connection. One day, Darren noticed a poster on the bulletin board near the cafeteria. It featured a photo of students from different backgrounds, smiling and working together. Above it, bold letters read, "Embrace your identity. Respect everyone's journey." Darren stood there for a moment, his chest swelling with pride. He didn't need his name on a program or a course to know that he'd made a difference. The proof was right in front of him, in the way his school was beginning to change. One afternoon, as Darren was leaving school, a teacher stopped him in the hallway. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice kind. "You've done more for this school than you realize." Darren didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. As he walked home that day, he thought about everything that had happened since the first day he stepped into this school. It hadn't been easy, and it was far from it. But every tear, every moment of frustration had led to something greater. Darren smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. The last day of school arrived with a crisp morning breeze that carried a sense of renewal. Darren walked through the now familiar hallways, a far cry from the nervous boy who had first stepped through these doors months ago. The stares and whispers that had once trailed him were gone, replaced by nods of acknowledgement and smiles from classmates. As he approached his locker, Sophie and Ethan were already waiting, leaning casually against the row of metal doors. Sophie's grin was as wide as ever, and Ethan adjusted his glasses with the air of someone holding back exciting news. "Okay, spill it," Darren said, smirking at their obvious anticipation. Sophie clapped her hands together, barely able to contain her excitement. "We just talked to Ms. Henson, and it's official that they're naming the Cultural Diversity Program after you." Ethan chimed in. "Starting next year, it'll be called the Darren Daniels Initiative for Cultural Awareness. They're even planning a special assembly to kick it off." For a moment, Darren didn't know what to say. He felt a surge of pride mixed with disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," Sophie said, nudging his arm. "You've made history, Darren." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone. You two were there every step of the way." Sophie waved off his modesty. "Maybe, but you were the spark that started it all. Don't forget that." The morning passed in a blur of final classes, goodbyes, and yearbook signings. As Darren moved from room to room, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The school felt different. It was now more welcoming and alive. Posters celebrating diversity lined the walls, their vibrant colors a reminder of the progress that had been made. Students from all backgrounds walked the halls with a new sense of confidence, their unique styles and cultures on full display. It wasn't perfect, Darren knew. Change never happened overnight, but it was a start. That afternoon, an end-of-year assembly was held in the gym. The bleachers were packed with students and staff, and the energy in the room was electric. Darren sat near the front with Sophie, Ethan, and his parents. Principal Henson took the stage, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This year has been one of challenges and growth for our school," she began. "We've faced difficult moments, but we've also come together in ways that have inspired real change." She paused, scanning the audience before her gaze landed on Darren. "Today, I want to take a moment to recognize a student who exemplifies courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Darren Daniels, would you please join me on stage?" A wave of applause erupted as Darren rose from his seat. His heart pounded as he walked to the stage, his palms damp with nervous energy. When he reached the microphone, Principal Henson stepped aside, giving him the floor. Darren looked out at the sea of faces, his classmates, his teachers, his parents, and even Coach Bailey, sitting stiffly in the back row. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "When I first came to this school," he began, his voice clear but quiet, "I felt like I didn't belong. I was different, and I thought that meant I had to change to fit in." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But over the past few months, I've learned something important. Being different isn't something to hide. It's something to celebrate. Our differences are what make us stronger, and no one has the right to take that away from us." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm proud of where I come from," Darren continued, his voice growing stronger, "and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. This school isn't perfect, but it's better than it was, and I know that if we keep working together, it can be even better." When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Darren stepped back, his heart swelling with pride as he took in the standing ovation. After the assembly, Darren found himself surrounded by friends, teachers, and even students he didn't know well. "You're a real inspiration, Darren," one teacher said, shaking his hand. Another student approached shyly. "I used to be scared to wear my hair natural," she admitted, "but after everything you did, I realized I didn't have to be. So, thank you." Darren smiled, his throat tightening with emotion. "That means a lot," he said simply. Later that evening, Darren and his parents sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, a quiet reminder of how far he'd come. "I'm proud of you, son," James said, his voice filled with warmth. "You've shown a strength that most people twice your age don't have." Darren glanced down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass of lemonade. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "Without you and Mom, and Sophie and Ethan." His mom smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're stronger than you think, Darren. Don't ever forget that." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the soft chirping of crickets in the distance. The next morning, Darren packed up his things for the summer. As he zipped his backpack, he noticed the small mirror on his desk and caught a glimpse of his reflection. His braids were back, neatly styled and glinting in the sunlight streaming through the window. He smiled at the boy staring back at him, a boy who had grown stronger, braver, and prouder of who he was. When Darren walked out the door, he carried not just his belongings but also the lessons he had learned and the change he had helped create. His story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Darren's journey wasn't just about overcoming humiliation. It was about rediscovering his strength and using his voice to inspire change. What started as a deeply personal struggle became a powerful movement that reshaped his school, making it a more inclusive and respectful environment for everyone. Darren's courage reminds us that, even in our most vulnerable moments, we have the power to stand tall, speak up, and make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. This story isn't just about a boy defending his hair or his culture. It's about the broader fight for acceptance and respect. Darren showed us the importance of unity and how the support of friends, family, and a community can turn pain into progress. His experience is a call to action for all of us to stand against discrimination, celebrate our differences, and make space for everyone to feel valued and seen. As you think about Darren's journey, ask yourself, What can you do to create a world where everyone feels they belong? It starts with kindness, empathy, and the bravery to challenge what's wrong. If you found Darren's story inspiring, let us know. Comment 1 if you liked it, and 2 if you thought it was amazing. We'd also love to hear your stories. How have you stood up for yourself or others? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Your voice matters, and together, we can keep making the world a better place.